Today at 6, we're in Downing Street at the start of the most unpredictable election campaign of recent times. A journey to the palace for the Prime Minister to visit the Queen as Parliament is dissolved. After 5 years in power, David Cameron urges voters to keep him in office to safeguard the economic recovery.
I will be going to all four corners of all four nations of our United Kingdom with one clear message. Together, we are turning our country around.
Labour launched its campaign with a promise to improve the lot of working families.
Creating higher living standards for working families, inspiring hope for our young people. These are our goals. This is our plan. Let's build a better country together.
And we'll be asking voters from London to Glasgow for their perspective at the start of this campaign.
I've never been interested in politics more than I am now.
I think it's going to be a very tight and confused one. I don't know which way to vote.
A very good evening from Downing Street. So the campaign is formally underway in what promises to be one of the closest and most unpredictable elections of recent times. David Cameron met the Queen at Buckingham Palace to mark the dissolution of Parliament. He returned here to number 10, where he urged voters to keep him in power to safeguard the economic recovery. But in a flavour of what's to come over the next 38 days, Labour accused Mr Cameron of destabilising British industry with his policy of a referendum on membership of the European Union. Well, our first report tonight on the day Parliament was dissolved is by our Deputy Political Editor, James Landale.
And so it begins. At exactly 1 minute past midnight, Parliament ceased to exist. It happens by law these days, once the 5 years is up, and David Cameron no longer needs to ask the Queen's permission. But off he went anyway, using all the status of his office to ask Her Majesty formally to summon the new Parliament in May. And then it was back to Downing Street and back to what he wants to be the central theme of the campaign, his promise of a growing economy, stronger leadership and fewer taxes than Labour.
In 38 days, you face a stark choice. The next Prime Minister walking through that door will be me or Ed Miliband. You can choose an economy that grows, that creates jobs, that generates the money to ensure a properly funded and improving National Health Service, a government that will cut taxes for 30 million hard-working people, and a country that is safe and secure. Or you can choose the economic chaos of Ed Miliband.
His hope is that that's the message that will persuade voters not to turn their backs on the Tories, votes he really needs if he's to stay in number 10. Over in the City of London, Labour was warning business leaders too of economic chaos if the Tories were re-elected. Ed Miliband arguing that the Tories' plans for an EU referendum and leadership contest would damage the economy, something he claimed many in business feared.
It is a recipe for at least 2 years of uncertainty in which inward investment would drain away. 2 years of uncertainty in which businesses will not be able to plan for the future. And 2 years of wasted opportunities for progress, for profit and for prosperity. It is a clear and present danger to British jobs, British business, British families and British prosperity.
This morning, officials began issuing writs triggering elections in all 650 constituencies. Elections that will not just choose the next Prime Minister, but may also shape the future of the UK, Britain's relationship with the EU and the economy in which we work. An election that's so close that the role of the smaller parties in the Queen's next Parliament will be vital. One of those smaller parties got their campaign underway today.
What's exciting for us, which is why I'm delighted the campaign has finally started, means that I can get out of offices in Whitehall and actually tell our side of the story, because where we tell that side of the story and people listen to it, we regain and hold on to people's support.
And yet the stakes at this election couldn't be higher for the Lib Dems. Either they stay in government or they become an endangered species at Westminster.
By the Queen, a proclamation for declaring the calling of the new Parliament.
As the election was proclaimed in Scotland, the SNP were in high spirits. Their leader hopes to win enough seats off Labour to hold sway in the new Parliament if there's a photo finish between Labour and the Tories, an outcome the polls, for now, suggest is likely.
SNP MPs will go to Westminster to fight Scotland's corner and to stand up for Scotland's interests and to fight for the issues that matter. We want to see an alternative to austerity.
Down in London, UKIP enthusiastically unveiled a new poster promising to spend more on health and cut taxes for those on the minimum wage, paid for by leaving the EU after a referendum, something their leader admitted he'd discussed informally with some Tories.
We're the only party in this campaign saying Britain should have a trade relationship with Europe but not membership of European Union. And directly as a consequence of that, we're the only party in this election that is actually offering a solution to the immigration crisis.
As Parliament packed up for the election, the Green Party urged voters to back what they called a peaceful political revolution to end business-as-usual politics. And the Welsh National Party, Plaid Cymru, urged voters to give them the chance of holding some power here when the removal lorries return in May. The next time David Cameron or Ed Miliband drive through these gates, it'll be to ask the Queen's permission to form a new government. The question is whether they'll need another party or parties to help them do it. The answer could shape the way we're governed for years. James Landau, BBC News at Buckingham Palace.
Well, as we've heard, the campaign started with the Conservatives claiming that a Labour government would increase the tax bill for working families by more than £3,000. But one independent expert from the Institute of Fiscal Studies said that that was an unhelpful figure based on too many assumptions. Well, our political correspondent Vicky Young explores the Conservative claims and the response.
If the books are going to be balanced, who will have to pay for it? The parties have very different ideas about how the purse strings should be tightened. Today, the Conservatives accuse Labour of planning tax rises of more than £3,000 for working households. But do their numbers add up? The first Conservative claim is that £30 billion needs to be found. That's if the books are to be balanced by 2017-18. But even this starting point is disputed. Labour have actually been quite vague about whether they'd stick to that 17-18 timetable. If they give themselves longer, the cuts aren't as drastic. The next Tory assumption is that Labour will find the money equally through tax rises and spending cuts. So that's how they reach £15 billion. But Labour have never confirmed this, and it seems to be based on something Ed Miliband said 5 years ago before he was party leader. As for the calculation itself, the Tories could have taken all households in the UK, about 30 million. Instead, they've used working households only, so 17 million. They've divided the £15 billion of tax rises by the 17 million households. That comes to £865 each, and they've multiplied that over 3.5 years to get the grand total of just over £3,000. The Tories admit this is an estimate, but say they're explaining to voters how Labour plans would affect them.
Well, unless they're going to tell us exactly how they're going to do it, then I'm afraid we're left to having to guess. What the Conservatives have been clear about is if we win this election, we will not balance the books of this country off the back of hard-working taxpayers.
The independent think tank, the IFS, says today's Tory figures aren't exactly helpful.
It's always important to treat these sorts of claims with a healthy degree of scepticism. There is some potential truth in there, in that Labour may well want to increase taxes at some point over the next Parliament to help deal with the deficit. But there's a huge amount of uncertainty about it. You certainly can't sensibly put a number as precise as £3,000 on it.
Labour aren't pinning down their exact tax and borrowing plans, which allows their opponents to write their own version. Clarity on all sides might help voters make up their minds. Vicky Young, BBC News.
Well now, one of Labour's main messages today was aimed at the business community. Ed Miliband said that electing a Conservative government would pose a clear and present danger to British firms by risking the UK's exit from the European Union. But Labour was then criticised by at least one company for using its comments for party political purposes. Our Labour campaign correspondent Lucy Manning reports now on Labour's claims today and the response.
Labour chose day one to show it means business. But did they back Ed Miliband? A party advert in the Financial Times seemed to show high-level support for Labour's claim that companies think pulling out of the EU would damage them. But some of the businesses, including Siemens, weren't entirely happy being used in this way.
Do you think Labour overstepped the mark?
The Siemens chief executive found himself pursued out of Ed Miliband's speech. He said he stood by the quote Labour had used, but was uncomfortable.
Would you rather Labour had left Siemens out of a political advert?
Well, certainly for the article to be very closely aligned to a Vote Labour campaign is not what Siemens would want.
2 other businesses quoted in the advert said they were politically neutral, but others gave Labour their backing.
It was very important that I was part of this. It was very much me publicly supporting the values and the principles of the Labour Party and the fact that I strongly believe we should be in Europe.
But was Labour overclaiming the level of business support for its policy of wanting to stay in the EU?
It seems that some of the companies that you quoted in your advert this morning are not happy about being used.
We've simply quoted public statements by these businesses about the place of Britain in the European Union. And I think that lots of businesses all around this country aren't necessarily going to be supporting Labour or the Conservatives, but they do have a very strong view about our place in the EU.
Labour says businesses were aware the quotes were going to be used. It's important for the party to show it has the business community on side, and it believes with its pro-European message, it will. Lucy Manning, BBC News, in the City.
Well, now, one of the big changes in this campaign is that, according to the opinion polls, the number of people who will not be supporting the Conservatives, Labour or the Lib Dems has doubled since the last election. And our correspondent John Kay has travelled from London to Glasgow, talking to voters along the way about what they want from this election campaign.
It's time to get out of this place because the election won't happen here.
This train is for Glasgow Central.
We're heading north to ask voters what they want from the campaign.
Straight talking.
Businesswoman Samantha Vickers is excited.
Really? Yeah, honestly, genuinely. I've never been interested in politics more than I am now, and I think possibly that's because I think some of the smaller parties might be able to have an influence.
I mean, I don't know which way to vote, and I'm not sure which politician to vote for, which party to vote for, because none of them are clear.
Our first stop is in the Midlands and Wolverhampton.
Diagnosis could be 1 or 2.
At the university, most of these nursing students will be casting a ballot for the first time. Or will they?
Can you put up your hand for me, please, if you have registered to vote in the general election?
Only about half, but there's still a real hunger here for the politicians to fight a clean and clear campaign.
They need to just break down all the noise and go down to the nitty-gritties, you know, just talking about each policy week by week.
I don't think they're out there speaking to the public enough. I think they should be going into schools more and speaking to the even younger generation. They should be coming here into universities, and I don't think they are.
I bet they will over the next few weeks.
We continue on our journey. Our next stop will be Cumbria. This livestock auction is 300 miles from Westminster.
I won't vote for any of them.
Many here feel voters in the countryside get ignored by the politicians.
We all know whatever they say and what they do are two completely different things, so...
I think they just need to listen to the rural communities and what they're speaking about a bit more sometimes.
Who do you think's going to win?
I wouldn't like to say. It's going to be tight, isn't it?
And so to Glasgow, a city which crackled with politics during the referendum 6 months ago.
Do you think people will turn out in the same kind of numbers for the general election?
Yes. I don't know if the same numbers, but I do think it will be increased.
I think you're more aware now of what's happening in the UK.
There doesn't seem to be the same excitement for the run-up to this one. So many things happening, so many new parties coming up.
Have you made your mind up?
Not yet.
5.5 weeks to decide. John Kay, BBC News.
Rita, thanks very much. Well then, with 38 days of campaigning to go, the size of the electoral challenge for the parties is clear. There are 650 seats at Westminster. 194 of them can be defined as marginal seats. That's where the majority last time was at most 10%. So with more details, here's Jeremy Vine with his look at the numbers that make up the political landscape.
Well, let's take a look first at the result of the last election. Conservatives, 307 seats in our virtual House of Commons here. Crucially, they didn't get through the 326 you need for an overall majority. Labour then, 258 seats. And then we'll put the Liberal Democrats on the government benches because they formed the coalition with their 57 seats. The others, the Northern Ireland parties, the nationalist parties, in total, 28. It painted the map like this, and the first thing you see on the floor here are these swathes of blue, but it's a bit misleading. The Conservatives didn't storm it, it's just that their constituencies are somewhat larger. In fact, if I make each MP a dot, you can see the story more clearly. In the northwest, these densely packed seats for Labour, strong in urban areas, strong as well in South Wales. This is where Labour does so well. The Liberal Democrats, lots of Lib Dem orange in the southwest of England, and not forgetting Scotland, where the SNP just had 6 MPs. Those are the yellow dots. It's expected to be many more this time. Have a look at the result in percentages from the last election. The Conservatives came first with 36%. Let's remember that figure. Labour had their second worst result since 1918. Lib Dems doing well with 23. UKIP on just 3%. The Greens and then the others you can see at the end here. Now, if we remember that Conservative figure, look at these graphs showing the averages of the polls going back to the election last time. The Conservatives, as you'd expect, slightly ahead in May 2010, and then gradually the problems of government press on them, and now Labour have a 10-point lead by 2012. But watch the Lib Dems gradually starting to slide, UKIP starting to come up, and by the end of the graph, here's what we see. A much stronger UKIP, a much weaker Lib Dems, but also at the top of the graph, 34-34, locked tight, Labour and the Conservatives. And of course that 34% is lower than the percentage the Conservatives got last time, and they didn't win an overall majority. That's why this election is so tight and so fascinating, and we're left looking at marginal constituencies. Now, I was in Birmingham this morning just reflecting on the West Midlands and how many of these red-blue contests there are. But of course this election features UKIP challenges around the coast, and also the SNP in Scotland just surging. That's why it goes beyond normal, beyond anything we've seen before. That's why it's fascinating.
So there we have Jeremy Vine with the figures. James Landale is with me here in Downing Street, our deputy political editor. The kinds of exchanges we saw today, James, are they the kinds of exchanges that will connect with voters or not?
Well, I think what we've seen today is very much familiar start of an election campaign. You've got one party being challenged over the claims it's making about the policies of another party. You had another party being challenged over the sort of proxy support it's claiming from outside business bodies. This is very familiar Westminster-focused kind of debates that we tend to have in election campaigns. You can never get away from it. Rouse over numbers, rouse over claims and counterclaims. I think the party that will break the deadlock in the opinion polls is the one that breaks through all of that to engage with voters. We heard many of those voices in John Kay's report asking for that, and I think the parties will try and find ways of jumping over people like me and you and other people in Westminster to talk directly to the parties. Because the point is, there's a huge amount at stake at this election. All the pollsters tell us it's going to be close. They all tell us that it's going to be very, very tight. And so there's a huge amount at stake. I think the parties will want to have not many more days like today.
James, thanks very much.